Amelia watched the old leather briefcase burn, a smirk of satisfaction playing on her lips. The flames licked at the worn, cracked hide, turning the dark brown leather to a brittle, glowing black. It curled and shrank in the intense heat of the backyard fire pit, a place usually reserved for pleasant summer evenings with friends, not for the spiteful immolation of a memory. To her, this wasn't just a briefcase. It was a symbol. It was the last pathetic remnant of Julian's father, a man she'd never met but had constructed in her mind as a simple, unambitious carpenter who had passed on his lack of drive to his son. It was a dusty, embarrassing relic that Julian, her husband, insisted on keeping in his home office, a constant, silent rebuke to the glossy, high-status life she so desperately craved and felt he was failing to provide. She thought she was destroying a worthless anchor to a past that was holding them back. She thought she was performing a sort of cleansing ritual, cauterizing a wound of mediocrity. She did not know she was incinerating her own future. She did not know that within the scorching heart of that fire, the deed to a $30 million estate was turning to ash. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? Judged by our cover, dismissed before we've had a chance to show who we truly are. It's a universal sting, a frustration that connects us no matter where we are in the world. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to it and see how a single, arrogant act can unravel an entire world built on false assumptions. The argument had started, as it so often did, over money. Not the immediate lack of it. Julian was a competent architect, and they lived comfortably enough in a pleasant suburban home. But the philosophical absence of it, the lack of vast money, the lack of the kind of wealth Amelia had been raised in, the kind her father Richard wielded like a scepter. "I just don't understand why you turned down the Henderson project," Amelia had said, her voice sharp with an exasperation she no longer bothered to conceal. She was standing in the doorway of his office, dressed for a gallery opening he had no interest in attending. Her dress was a sliver of black silk that had cost more than their monthly mortgage payment. It was a multi-million-dollar build. The commission alone would have been a fortune. Julian didn't look up from the schematics spread across his desk. He was tracing a line with the tip of his finger, his focus absolute. The Hendersons wanted to cut corners, Amelia. They wanted to use substandard materials on a public-use structure. It wouldn't have been safe. It wouldn't have been right. "Right?" she scoffed, the sound like breaking glass. "What does right have to do with it?" "Richard, my father, says that in business you do what it takes to win. You're always so caught up in these little principles. It's why you're stuck. It's why we're here," she said, gesturing vaguely at their tastefully decorated but, in her eyes, hopelessly modest home. "I'm an architect. My name goes on the building. My integrity goes with it," Julian replied, his voice calm, measured. It was this quietude, this refusal to be drawn into her emotional tempests, that infuriated her the most. It was like shouting at a mountain. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a target, a physical manifestation of her frustration. They landed on the briefcase. It was tucked into a corner beside an old wooden filing cabinet. It was his father's. Dark brown leather, scuffed at the corners, the brass latches tarnished with age. To her, it was an eyesore. It was everything she hated about Julian's worldview, condensed into a single, shabby object. "And that," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger, "is the problem. You cling to this junk, relics of a man who was happy to work with his hands and never amount to anything. You're just like him." Julian finally looked up. His gaze was steady, his blue eyes holding a depth she had never bothered to try and understand. "My father was a good man. He was an honest man. There is more value in that than in all the money your father has ever made." The statement, delivered without heat, was somehow more insulting to her than a scream would have been. It was a judgment. It was a dismissal of her entire world, of the very air she breathed. "We'll see about that," she had hissed, her eyes narrowing on the briefcase. An hour later, while Julian was out on a rare evening walk to clear his head, she had acted. She dragged the heavy case from his office, her heels digging into the plush hallway carpet. She'd hauled it through the kitchen, out the back door, and to the edge of the stone fire pit. She doused it with lighter fluid, the chemical smell sharp and clean in the cool evening air. She hadn't even tried to open it. The contents were irrelevant. It was the symbol she wanted to destroy. With a flick of a long-stemmed match, she had set her husband's past and her own future ablaze. She watched the flames consume the leather, a feeling of triumphant release washing over her. She had finally severed the tie. She had made a definitive statement. She was in control. The smoke, thick and acrid, rose into the twilight sky, carrying with it the scent of burning leather, and though she could not smell it, $30 million of incinerated paper. When Julian returned, the first thing he noticed was the smell, a chemical bitterness overlaying the scent of wood smoke. It was a smell of deliberate destruction. He walked through the house, a sense of cold dread coiling in his stomach. He saw the empty space in the corner of his office. His heart, which had been beating at a steady, contemplative rhythm from his walk, began to hammer against his ribs. He didn't run. He walked, his steps measured, out the back door and onto the patio. The fire pit was a nest of angry, glowing embers. Atop the smoldering logs lay the blackened, skeletal remains of the briefcase. The brass latches, warped and discolored, were still visible, like crooked teeth in a charred skull. The leather was gone, transformed into a brittle crust of ash that shifted and crumbled in the gentle breeze. Amelia was standing by the glass doors, a wine glass in her hand, her expression a careful mixture of defiance and nonchalance. "It was an eyesore, Julian. It's time we moved on. Created a home that reflects success." Julian didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the fire. He felt a profound, hollow ache in his chest, a grief that was deeper than anger. It wasn't just a briefcase. It was the last physical thing his father had given him. It was a vessel of memory, of love, of a quiet and powerful legacy she could never comprehend. He walked slowly to the edge of the pit. The heat washed over his face. He could see the ghost of the case, its shape still etched in the embers. He crouched down, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of unreadable calm. This unnerved Amelia far more than any outburst would have. She had expected shouting, accusations, a satisfyingly dramatic fight. She was met with a silence that felt heavier, more dangerous than any sound. "What's wrong?" she asked, a slight tremor of uncertainty in her voice. "It was just an old bag. You can get a new one. A better one. Something from this century." Julian still didn't respond. His eyes were scanning the ashes, his mind working with the cold precision of an architect assessing a collapsed structure. He saw the warped metal frame, the molten clasps, and then he saw it. A small metallic glint nestled deep within the glowing red heart of the embers. It was a corner of something, something designed to withstand this exact kind of disaster. His father had been a man of quiet foresight, a man who believed in contingency plans. "Never put all your trust in one system, son," he used to say, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Always have a backup, a fail-safe." Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. Attached to the ring was another, smaller key. A simple, silver key, no bigger than his thumb. It was the key to a safe deposit box. A safe deposit box that contained a meticulously organized portfolio, a certified, notarized copy of his father's last will and testament, and a duplicate, legally binding copy of the deed she had just so gleefully destroyed. The original deed, the one signed in his father's elegant, confident hand, was gone. That was a tragedy, a sentimental loss that cut him to the core. But the inheritance itself? That was secure, more secure than Amelia could ever imagine. The fire had not destroyed his future, it had merely clarified it. It had burned away the last vestiges of his hope for their marriage, revealing the cold, hard truth of what lay beneath. He stood up, turning to face her for the first time. There was no anger in his eyes. There was something far colder, pity and resolution. "You're right," he said, his voice unnervingly soft. "It is time to move on." She smiled, relieved. She took his words as surrender, as an admission that she had been right all along. "I'm so glad you see it my way, darling," she said, walking toward him, her hand outstretched. "Now we can finally start building the life we deserve." Julian looked at her outstretched hand, then back at her face. He saw the triumph in her eyes, the utter blissful ignorance, and in that moment he didn't feel rage. He felt a profound, chilling clarity. The chessboard was set. Her move had been reckless, arrogant, and ultimately fatal. Now it was his turn to play. He let her hand hang in the air between them, a silent, unanswered plea. The game had begun, and she, in her blindness, had no idea she had already been placed in checkmate. The days that followed were steeped in a strange, tense quiet. Amelia interpreted Julian's calm as a sign of defeat. She saw his methodical tidying of his office, his long, quiet hours spent on the phone, as him retreating into his shell, a wounded animal licking its wounds. She felt a smug sense of victory. She had, she believed, finally broken his sentimental attachment to the past and forced him into the present she was designing for them. She moved through the house with a renewed sense of ownership, making lists of renovations, browsing catalogs for expensive furniture, and planning lavish dinner parties. She was the queen of a castle she was about to upgrade, entirely unaware that the foundations were already condemned. One evening, about a week after the fire, she brought up the topic of her parents' annual summer gala. It was the premier social event of the season, a gathering of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures, all converging on her parents' sprawling estate. "Daddy is expecting you to be there, of course," she said, applying her makeup at her vanity. "And for God's sake, Julian, please try to look the part this time. No more of those dreary gray suits. I've scheduled a fitting for you at Armani." Julian was standing in the doorway, holding a simple manila envelope. It was one of several that had arrived by courier that day. "I don't think I'll be able to make it this year, Amelia." She spun around on her stool, her eyes flashing with anger. "What do you mean you won't be able to make it? It's not a request, it's an expectation. My father is honoring a new business partner. It's important. You being there, by my side, is important for our image." "Our image," Julian repeated softly. The words hung in the air, stripped of their usual meaning. He looked at the envelope in his hand. It was thin, unassuming, yet it held more weight than the entirety of Richard's ostentatious mansion. "I have some business of my own to attend to." "Business?" she laughed, a harsh, condescending sound. "What business could you possibly have that's more important than networking with people who could actually help your career? Don't tell me you're still moping about that dusty old briefcase. I did you a favor." This was the moment, the opening, the point where the facade of his patience could have cracked. But it didn't. And he met her gaze with that same unsettling placidity. "The briefcase," he said, his voice level, "is a topic for another time, a more formal setting." He then did something that confused her completely. He walked over to his closet and pulled out a suit. It wasn't one of his usual, understated gray or charcoal suits. It was a deep midnight blue, exquisitely tailored, made from a fabric that seemed to drink the light. He had never worn it before. She had never even seen it. "Where did that come from?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her irritation. "It was my father's," he said simply, laying it out on the bed. "He had it made for a special occasion." I suppose this qualifies. The idea that his simple carpenter father would own such a suit was incongruous. It didn't fit the narrative she had so carefully constructed. It was a small detail, a tiny crack in the wall of her certainty, but she dismissed it. She assumed he was lying, perhaps having bought it himself in a pathetic attempt to impress her. The night of the gala arrived. As promised, Julian did not attend. Amelia went with her parents, Richard and Eleanor, making excuses for her husband's absence. "He's just swamped with a new project," she lied smoothly, the falsehood tasting like honey on her tongue. So dedicated. Richard, a bull of a man with a florid face and a voice accustomed to booming across boardrooms, clapped a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Dedication is one thing, Amelia. Results are another. He's been dedicated for 10 years, and what has he got to show for it? A 3-bedroom house in a mid-range sedan." He laughed, and the circle of sycophants around him joined in. Eleanor, her mother, stood by her husband's side, her expression serene, a pearl necklace gleaming at her throat. She offered a polite, non-committal smile. She was a master of passive agreement, a silent enabler whose failure to object was a form of endorsement. She had watched her husband belittle Julian for years, her silence a quiet, steady poison in the family dynamic. Throughout the evening, Amelia felt a strange, persistent prickle of unease. Julian's calm was a puzzle she couldn't solve. His new suit, his quiet refusal to attend the gala, his talk of formal settings, it didn't add up. But surrounded by the glittering opulence of her parents' world, she pushed the feeling down. Here, she was safe. Here, she was powerful. Julian and his quiet little life felt a million miles away. Meanwhile, miles away from the clinking champagne glasses and false laughter, Julian was in a different kind of meeting. He was not in a boardroom, but in the quiet, wood-paneled office of Mr. Alistair Harrison. Mr. Harrison was a legend in the world of estate law, a silver-haired man with eyes that missed nothing. He was his father's executor and for the past decade, a silent observer of Julian's life. "The report is complete, Julian," Mr. Harrison said, sliding a thick, leather-bound document across the polished mahogany desk. "Every incident has been logged. Every email, every text message, every witness conversation. Your father was very specific about the terms." Julian opened the document. It was a meticulous, devastating chronicle of his marriage. The list of grievances, dates, times, locations, the casual insults, the public humiliations, the deep, cutting remarks about his father, his career, his character. Seeing it all laid out in cold, black and white print was sobering. It wasn't just a series of bad moments. It was a pattern of sustained, systemic disrespect. "The burning of the briefcase was the final entry," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice gentle but firm. "An act of such profound contempt that it leaves no room for ambiguity. According to the clause your father wrote into his will, the mutual respect and support clause, this constitutes a definitive breach." Julian nodded slowly, closing the binder. He felt a wave of sadness, not for the loss of his marriage, which he now understood had been an illusion for years, but for the necessity of this action. And the other matter? The lease for Richard's primary warehouse? Mr. Harrison permitted himself a small, thin smile. "The property is, of course, part of the Northwood estate. The lease, which your father generously extended to his son-in-law's company at a significantly below-market rate, expires in 60 days. As the new owner of the estate, you are under no obligation to renew it." Poetic justice. The man who mocked Julian's lack of business acumen had built a significant portion of his logistics empire on land unknowingly subsidized by the very family he scorned. "Then it's time," Julian said, his voice gaining a new note of authority. He stood up and straightened the jacket of his father's beautiful suit. It fit him perfectly. "Please arrange the meeting," My office. 3 days from now. Amelia, Richard, and Eleanor. It's time for a conversation about value. The air in Julian's small home office was thick with resentment. Amelia, Richard, and Eleanor sat opposite his modest desk, their expressions ranging from annoyed to openly hostile. They had been summoned by a formal email from an unknown law firm, requesting their presence for a matter of urgent family business. The very idea that Julian could have urgent business that required their attendance was, to them, absurd. "All right, Julian, what is this all about?" Richard began, his voice dripping with impatience. He checked his gold Rolex, a gesture of performative importance. "Some of us have actual work to do. Is your car broken down again? Do you need another loan you'll never manage to repay?" Amelia smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Honestly, Julian, the drama. If you needed to talk, you could have just said so at dinner. You didn't need to hire a lawyer to send a scary email." Eleanor, as usual, was silent. She smoothed a wrinkle from her linen skirt, her gaze fixed on a point just over Julian's shoulder, a portrait of practiced disengagement. Julian remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair. He was the picture of calm. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his tone polite, almost serene. "This won't take long, but it is, as the email stated, urgent." As if on cue, there was a soft knock on the office door. Julian opened it to reveal Mr. Alistair Harrison, who stepped into the room carrying a slim but heavy-looking portfolio. He was dressed in a suit that was even more expensive than Richard's, and he carried an aura of quiet, unassailable authority. Richard's blustering demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. He recognized the man instantly. "Harrison?" he said, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Alistair Harrison? What in God's name are you doing here? In this place?" The disdain for Julian's home was reflexive. "Richard," Mr. Harrison greeted him with a cool, professional nod. He then turned his attention to the others. "Mrs. Beaumont, Amelia." He did not sit. He stood beside Julian, the two of them presenting a quiet, united front. The power dynamic in the room had subtly shifted. Richard was no longer the most important man present, and the uncertainty was written all over his face. "Mr. Harrison is my legal counsel," Julian explained simply. "He was also my father's." Amelia scoffed. "Your father's? What would a carpenter need with a man like Alistair Harrison?" Julian ignored her. He looked directly at his wife, his eyes holding hers. The moment of revelation had arrived. The quiet before the storm was over. "Amelia," he began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the small room. "A few weeks ago, you made a decision. You went into this office, took a personal possession of mine, and you burned it." "Oh, for heaven's sake, are we back on that again?" she snapped, rolling her eyes. "It was a piece of trash, Julian. I did you a favor." "You thought it was a piece of trash," Julian corrected her gently. "You assumed, as you have assumed for the entire duration of our marriage, that you knew its value. You were mistaken." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the suffocating quiet. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Eleanor's hands were now clenched tightly in her lap. "That briefcase was given to me by my father on my 18th birthday," Julian continued, his voice a steady, narrative thread. "He wasn't a simple carpenter, Amelia. That was a story he told. A life he chose to live after he had already built his fortune. My father, Robert Vance, was the founder and sole proprietor of Northwood Holdings, a private real estate investment firm." A flicker of disbelief, then dawning horror crossed Amelia's face. Richard sat bolt upright, his face paling. The name Northwood Holdings was not unknown to him. It was a ghost in the industry, a legendary firm known for acquiring vast tracts of valuable land and then disappearing from the public eye. "That's impossible," Richard stammered. "Northwood was run by a recluse. No one ever knew who he was." He valued his privacy, Julian said. He believed that a man's worth was in what he built, not what he displayed. A philosophy, I'm afraid, that this family has never understood. Mr. Harrison stepped forward and opened his portfolio on the desk. He laid out a document, its letterhead crisp and official. It was a summary of assets. As of the last valuation, the lawyer said, his voice dry and factual, Northwood Holdings, now the Northwood Estate, is valued at approximately $32 million. Amelia made a small, choking sound. Her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly seemed garish, her expensive jewelry tawdry. The briefcase you burned, Amelia, Julian said, his gaze pinning her in place, contained many of my father's personal papers. It also contained the original, signed deed that transferred the entirety of the Northwood estate to me upon his passing. The room was utterly silent. The hum of the computer on the desk sounded like a roaring engine. Amelia's face had gone from disbelief to a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sallow and suddenly older. "You're lying," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "This is a trick, a sick, cruel joke." "Is it?" Julian asked calmly. He gestured to Mr. Harrison. The lawyer produced another document from his portfolio. It was a copy of Robert Vance's last will and testament. He placed it on the desk in front of them. "The will is quite clear," Mr. Harrison stated. "Julian is the sole heir. However, your father Julian was a man who believed deeply in the sanctity of marriage. He included a specific provision, a morality clause, if you will." Mr. Harrison looked directly at Amelia, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "The clause stipulates that the inheritance and all assets therein are to be shared with Julian's spouse, but only on the condition that the marriage is, and has been, a partnership of mutual love, respect, and support. For the past 2 years, as per Robert's instructions, my firm has been tasked with evaluating whether this condition has been met." He then produced the third document, the thick, leather-bound report Julian had reviewed in his office. He didn't open it. He simply let it rest on the desk, a silent, damning testament. "This report," Mr. Harrison said, "chronicles a pattern of behavior that, in our legal opinion, constitutes a flagrant and sustained violation of that clause. It details years of disparagement, contempt, and emotional abuse. It concludes," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "with the willful destruction of a priceless sentimental object, and more critically, what you believe to be the primary legal instrument of the inheritance itself. An act of profound and malicious disrespect." The quiet bomb had been dropped. It wasn't a loud explosion, but a silent, devastating implosion of Amelia's entire reality. Julian's voice was soft when he spoke again, cutting through the ringing silence. "The fire you set, Amelia, was a crime. Destruction of private property, attempted interference with the execution of a will. But more than that, it was a moment of absolute clarity. It was the final piece of evidence." He looked from his wife to her father, and then to her mother. He saw their world tilting on its axis, their faces a collage of horror, greed, and disbelief. "The original deed is gone, yes," Julian conceded, a flicker of genuine pain in his eyes. "You destroyed a piece of my father's history, but you did not, as you hoped, destroy my future. You see, my father taught me to always have a contingency. He was a man who built things to last." He paused, letting the architectural metaphor hang in the air. "Mr. Harrison holds a certified, notarized, and legally unassailable duplicate of the deed, along with the will. The inheritance is secure. My inheritance." The silence that followed was a living thing, writhing with unspoken accusations and the frantic, desperate whirring of minds trying to catch up with a reality that had just been shattered. Richard was the first to break it. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now suffused with a dark, apoplectic red. This is preposterous. A trick, he boomed, slamming his hand on Julian's desk. The flimsy piece of furniture rattled under the impact. You think you can come in here with some high-priced lawyer and a book of lies and steal my daughter's future? We'll see you in court. We'll tear this ridiculous claim to shreds. Mr. Harrison didn't even flinch. He simply tapped the thick, leather-bound report. By all means, Richard, proceed with litigation. This report, which contains sworn affidavits from colleagues, friends, and even household staff, along with a complete record of digital communications, will become public record. I imagine the press would be quite interested in the details of how the Beaumont family treats their own. It would make for a fascinating story about value. The lawyer's use of Julian's earlier word was a deliberate, surgical strike. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The threat was clear. The public humiliation, the airing of their dirty laundry, would be catastrophic for the carefully curated Beaumont image. Amelia, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation that was both hideous and pitiful to behold. The mask of arrogance had completely dissolved, replaced by a desperate, pleading terror. The gears in her mind had finally clicked into place, calculating the sheer magnitude of what she had lost, what she had, in fact, burned with her own two hands. "Julian," she began, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar whine. She stood up and came around the desk, her hands outstretched, her eyes wide and swimming with manufactured tears. "Julian, darling, it was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. I was angry. I wasn't thinking. You know how I get." She tried to touch his arm, but he took a small step back, the movement subtle but decisive. It was a rejection as complete as a slammed door. "I didn't know," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "If I had known—" "My God, Julian, you have to believe me. I love you. This doesn't have to change anything between us. We can fix this. We are a team." The word "we" sounded obscene coming from her lips. Julian looked at her, at this stranger who wore his wife's face, and he felt a profound emptiness. He was looking at a woman mourning the loss of a lottery ticket, not the destruction of her marriage. Her grief was for the money and nothing else. "There is nothing to fix, Amelia," he said, and the finality in his tone chilled the room. "The clause in my father's will was a test of character, and you have failed it in the most spectacular way imaginable." He looked past her to her father. "As for you, Richard," he said, his voice hardening slightly, "you have spent the last 10 years mocking my profession, my ambition, and my perceived lack of business sense. You have called me a failure at your dinner table, in front of your friends, and to my own wife. Yet for the last 8 of those years, your primary logistics warehouse, the very hub of your import-export business, has been operating on land you leased from Northwood Holdings." Richard's face went from red to a waxy, unhealthy gray. "My father, in a gesture of familial goodwill he thought you might one day reciprocate, gave you a lease at a rate that is less than a quarter of the current market value," Julian continued, the words falling like hammer blows. "That lease expires in 53 days. As the new owner of the Northwood estate, I can assure you it will not be renewed. You will be required to vacate the premises by the end of the quarter. I wish you the best of luck finding a comparable facility at your current operating budget." This was the masterstroke, the poetic justice. Julian hadn't just disarmed his antagonist, he had dismantled the very engine of his arrogance. Richard's empire, built on a foundation of condescension and borrowed luck, was about to crumble. The man who saw Julian as a worthless nobody was now at his mercy, and Julian was choosing not to extend it. Finally, Julian's gaze settled on Eleanor. She had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, a statue of pale, wealthy indifference. She was wringing her hands now, her knuckles white. She wouldn't meet his eye. "And you, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice softening not with warmth, but with a deep, sorrowful disappointment. You are perhaps the most tragic figure in this room. You are not cruel like your husband or pathologically selfish like your daughter, but you are weak. You stood by for a decade and watched them chip away at my dignity, at our marriage, and you never said a single word. You chose comfortable silence over basic human decency. Your silence was its own form of poison. He let that accusation hang in the air, a moral mirror forced in front of her face. He was not shouting. He was not condemning her to any financial ruin. He was simply stating a truth she could not refute. And in doing so, he was passing a judgment far more profound. "I am filing for divorce, Amelia," Julian stated, his voice ringing with the clear, cold chime of a bell. "Effective immediately. Per the terms of the will, which Mr. Harrison will now execute, you will receive no part of the Northwood estate. The community property we currently share, this house and its contents, will be divided as per state law. I will not be contesting your right to half of its value. I want nothing from our life together. I am moving on." He looked at the three of them, a family unit shattered by its own toxicity. The arrogant bully, the grasping narcissist, the silent enabler. They were the architects of their own destruction. "The meeting is over," Julian said. "Mr. Harrison will be in touch with your lawyers." With that, he turned, walked out of his office, and gently closed the door, leaving them to suffocate in the ruins of the world they had built. The months that followed were a study in consequences. The fallout from that single, devastating meeting rippled through the Beaumont family like a shockwave, dismantling their lives with methodical precision. The divorce was swift and brutal. Stripped of the leverage of Julian's anticipated inheritance, Amelia's legal position was laughably weak. The prenuptial agreement they had signed, which she had insisted upon at her father's urging to protect her family's assets from Julian, was now an ironic cage. It entitled her to half the value of their modest home and her personal effects, and nothing more. The $30 million dream she had held in her grasp for a fleeting, horrifying moment had vanished as completely as the smoke from the fire she had set. We see her, 3 months later, not in a sleek downtown penthouse, but in a small, generic one-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of the city. The furniture is new and cheap, from a flat-pack store. The vibrant, confident woman from the gallery openings is gone, replaced by a paler, thinner version. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, are now chapped from washing her own dishes. She is working for the first time in her life, a humiliating entry-level position as an administrative assistant at a marketing firm, a job procured for her by one of her mother's few remaining friends. Her days are a monotonous loop of answering phones and scheduling meetings for people she once would have considered her social inferiors. Her evenings are long and quiet. The friends who once flocked to her side for gossip and champagne have evaporated, their loyalty as superficial as the society pages they appeared in. We see her scrolling through her phone, her thumb hovering over Julian's number. She types out long, pleading texts filled with apologies, declarations of love, and desperate promises to change, but she never sends them. She knows, with a certainty that gnaws at her soul, that it's not him she misses. It is the life he represented, the life she threw away. Her regret is real, but it is the regret of a gambler who has lost everything on a foolish bet, not the sorrow of a woman who has lost the love of her life. The change is not internal. It is merely a change of circumstance. Richard's downfall was more spectacular, a public demolition of a man defined by his image. The loss of the Northwood warehouse was a catastrophic blow to his business. The facility was centrally located, perfectly optimized, and most importantly, absurdly cheap. Finding a replacement at market rates proved impossible without liquidating other assets. His creditors, sensing weakness, began to call in their loans. The business, a house of cards built on an unsustainable financial model and propped up by his father-in-law's secret generosity, began to collapse. We see him in a sterile boardroom, his face ashen, his usual booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper as he negotiates the sale of his crumbling company for pennies on the dollar. The men across the table, men he once would have dominated with sheer force of personality, now look at him with a mixture of pity and predatory glee. His Rolex is gone, sold to pay legal fees. His confidence, his very identity, has been stripped away. He is a king without a kingdom, a blustering windbag in a deflating balloon. He tries to reach Julian through back channels, sending emissaries with offers, threats, and pleas, but all messages go unanswered. Julian has excised him from his life as cleanly as a surgeon removing a tumor. Richard is left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own arrogance. The most profound change, however, was in Eleanor. In the aftermath of the meeting, she was faced with a choice she had been avoiding for decades. She could stand by her husband, clinging to the wreckage of their social standing, or she could finally acknowledge the truth that Julian had held up to her like a mirror. For weeks she remained in the cavernous, silent mansion, watching Richard rage and crumble. She watched him blame everyone but himself, Julian, the economy, disloyal partners, and even her, for not raising a more cunning daughter. One morning she simply packed a single suitcase. She did not take her jewelry or her designer clothes. She took the simple things, the items that held personal meaning. She left a note on the grand mahogany dining table where Julian had been insulted so many times. It was not for Richard. It was for her. 2 weeks later, a simple, handwritten letter arrived for Julian at his temporary residence, a quiet, furnished apartment he had rented while his new life took shape. It was from Eleanor. It was not a letter asking for forgiveness, nor was it an attempt at reconciliation. It was a simple, elegant, and heartbreaking admission of her own failure. "Dear Julian," it read, "there are no words to undo the silence of a decade. I see that now. I chose comfort over courage, and I allowed my home to become a place of cruelty. I do not ask you to forgive me, for I have not yet forgiven myself. I only wanted to tell you that you were right. You were a good and decent man in a house that did not deserve you. I have left Richard. I do not know where I am going, but I know I am going toward a place where I can perhaps learn to be a person of integrity, like your father, and like you. I wish you the peace you have so rightfully earned. Sincerely, Eleanor." Julian read the letter twice, a complex mix of sadness and respect settling in his heart. Of the three Beaumonts, she was the only one capable of genuine redemption, because she was the only one willing to look inward. And Julian? He was at peace. We see him standing on a hill overlooking a vast expanse of rolling greenland, dotted with ancient oaks and bisected by a sparkling river. This is the Northwood Estate. It is more beautiful than any photograph could capture. The main house is a masterpiece of classic, understated architecture, stone and glass and rich, dark wood, built to harmonize with the landscape, not dominate it. It is a house built by a man who loved the earth it stood on. Julian is not alone. He is walking with Mr. Harrison, pointing out different features of the land. He is not talking about development potential or property values. He is talking about conservation easements and public walking trails. He's holding a set of rolled-up blueprints. They are not for a corporate tower or a luxury condominium. They are the initial designs for the Robert Vance Foundation for Architectural Integrity, a nonprofit he is establishing with the estate's immense resources. Its mission: to fund and build beautiful, sustainable, and affordable public housing projects, and to provide scholarships for young architects who, like him, believe that buildings should serve people, not just profits. He has turned his inheritance not into a monument to wealth, but into an engine for the very principles he was once mocked for holding. He has transformed his pain into purpose. The final scene unfolds 6 months later. The autumn sun casts long shadows across the grounds of the Northwood Estate. The leaves on the ancient oaks are a riot of gold and crimson. Julian is in the library of the main house, a room his father had filled with thousands of books on architecture, history, and philosophy. The room is quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and lemon oil. It is a sanctuary of thought and peace. Mr. Harrison is with him, seated in a worn leather armchair by the fireplace. They are finalizing the last of the legal paperwork for the foundation. The transfers are complete. Julian's new life has officially begun. Your father would be incredibly proud, Julian, Mr. Harrison says, his voice holding a rare note of personal warmth. He looks around the room at the legacy of a man he had deeply respected. He always knew the strength of your character. He used to say, "The world will test him, Alistair. It will mistake his kindness for weakness and his patience for apathy. But when the time comes, the steel in his spine will show." It seems he was, as in all things, correct. Julian smiles, a genuine, relaxed smile that reaches his eyes. It is the smile of a man who is entirely at home in his own skin. He taught me that the strongest structures have the deepest foundations. I was just applying his principles. He walks over to a small, handsome wooden box on the mantelpiece. He opens it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, is a single, small, silver key. It's the key to the safe deposit box, the key that held the duplicate of his entire future. Beside it is the charred, warped brass latch he had managed to salvage from the fire pit on that terrible night. He had kept it, not as a reminder of Amelia's betrayal, but as a reminder of the fire that had burned away all illusions and forced him onto his true path. It was a symbol not of loss, but of purification. He picks up the key, feeling its cool, solid weight in his palm. It is a symbolic object that no longer represents a hidden power, but a power that has been realized and put to good use. He looks at it for a long moment, then closes his hand around it. He has faced the humiliation, weathered the storm, and emerged not just victorious, but wiser. He did not sink to the level of his tormentors. He did not become cruel or vindictive. He simply held up a mirror and allowed them to face the consequences of their own reflections. He maintained his moral high ground, and in doing so, achieved a victory that was not just financial, but spiritual. The narrator's voice returns, warm and reflective, a final thought to bind the story together. In the end, true worth is never found in the gleam of gold or the applause of a crowd. It cannot be measured by the size of a house or the price of a suit. It is forged in quiet moments of integrity, in the patient endurance of disrespect, and in the courage to stand by one's principles when it is easiest to abandon them. Arrogance builds a house of cards, beautiful but fragile, destined to collapse at the first gust of truth. Integrity, however, builds a foundation of stone, a structure that can withstand any storm and will endure for generations. Julian places the key back in the box and closes the lid with a soft, final click. He has made his peace with the past. He turns to Mr. Harrison, the blueprints for the first foundation project in his hand, a look of quiet, forward-looking purpose on his face. The story of his humiliation is over. The story of his legacy is just beginning. So, what do you think? Did Amelia and Richard truly get what they deserved? Or was Julian's justice too cold? Is there a path to redemption for someone like Amelia? Or are some choices simply unforgivable? We'd love to read your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Every story has a lesson, and your perspective is a valuable part of that. Thank you for joining us for this journey. If you found this story of vindication and integrity satisfying, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us that patience and quiet strength are the most powerful forces of all. Until next time, remember to value the quiet worth within yourself and to look for it in others. You never know what hidden strength lies just beneath the surface.